This shouldn't exist, and yet it does. Before Hollywood had rules, what exactly were they putting on screen? Not hints, explicit choices, not consequences, no punishment. Entire films built on ideas that would be banned just a few years later. And somehow, most people have never even heard of them. So what changed? And why were these movies quietly buried? Because once you see what they were doing, you can't unsee it. Scarface, 1932. It doesn't start like a rise to power. It feels like something breaking loose. Scarface throws you straight into ambition that doesn't wait for permission. Every move is louder than the last. Every decision pushes further than expected. And there's no moment where the film slows down to question it. That's what makes it dangerous. You're not watching a character grow. You're watching momentum take over. Violence isn't treated like a consequence. It becomes a language, a way of communicating power. And the more it escalates, the more normal it starts to feel. That's the trap. Because by the time you realize how far it's gone, you're already inside it. And the film doesn't pull you out. It keeps pushing, scene after scene, until everything collapses under the weight of its own excess. What stays with you isn't just the story, it's the pace. The feeling that nothing was ever going to stop it. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. It wasn't trying to be controlled, it was showing what happens when nothing is. Gold Diggers of 1933. 1933. It looks like entertainment, until it starts saying something else entirely. Gold Diggers of 1933 begins with energy, music, and movement that feels almost comforting. But that comfort doesn't last. Beneath the choreography, there's tension, a quiet awareness of struggle, of survival, of people trying to hold on to something that keeps slipping away. And then the visuals shift. Patterns become overwhelming. Faces blur into repetition. The scale increases until it feels less like performance and more like construction. Like something carefully designed to stay in your mind long after it ends. That's the shift most viewers don't expect. It doesn't announce it, it just happens, and once it does, you can't unsee it. The film stops being light and starts feeling layered, not in a complex way, but in a deliberate one. Every movement has purpose, every sequence builds something underneath the surface, and by the end, what looked simple at the beginning feels completely different. Like you weren't just watching a musical, you were being guided through something structured to linger. Mystery of the Wax Museum, 1933. It feels controlled at first, almost too controlled. Mystery of the Wax Museum doesn't rush its tension, it lets it sit. The environment feels stable, the characters feel grounded, and nothing immediately signals danger. But that's where it starts working against you. Because the stillness isn't comfort, it's preparation. Small details begin to feel off. Expressions last a little too long. Movements feel slightly unnatural. And slowly, without announcing it, the film begins to shift. Not into chaos, but into realization. The kind that builds quietly until it becomes impossible to ignore. And when the truth starts to surface, it doesn't hit through shock. It hits through recognition, because everything was already there. You just didn't see it yet. That's what makes it linger. Not what happens, but how long it takes you to understand it. And once you do, there's no way to return to how it felt at the beginning. The control you trusted becomes part of the discomfort. And that's the real twist. It never changed. You did. Dr. X, 1932. It doesn't look like horror. It feels like distortion. Dr. X uses color in a way that doesn't guide the viewer. It unsettles them. The tones aren't natural. The environment doesn't feel stable. And the more you watch, the more it starts to feel like something isn't aligned. Not in the story, but in the presentation itself. That's where it becomes effective. Because instead of building fear through events, it builds it through atmosphere. Everything looks slightly off, slightly unnatural, and that slightly never goes away. It stays consistent. It builds slowly, and over time it becomes overwhelming. The science at the center of the story doesn't feel like discovery. It feels like control pushed too far. And the film doesn't try to reassure you. It doesn't balance the tone. It commits to the discomfort. That's what makes it stand out. Not because it's loud, but because it's persistent. It doesn't need to shock you. It just needs to keep you inside that unstable feeling long enough that it becomes impossible to ignore. Female, 1933. It flips the structure immediately and never explains itself. Female presents power in a way that feels direct, controlled, and completely unapologetic. There's no buildup, no transition. Just a dynamic that exists from the start and continues without interruption. And that's what creates tension, because the audience isn't guided on how to respond. There's no framing to soften it, no commentary to balance it. It simply unfolds. The character at the center operates with clarity. Every decision is intentional. Every interaction follows a pattern that never shifts. And instead of challenging that pattern, the film reinforces it. That's where it becomes uncomfortable. Not because it's extreme, but because it's consistent. It doesn't break. It doesn't adjust. It just continues. And that continuation forces the viewer to engage with it on their own terms. There's no resolution offered. No clear outcome presented as right or wrong. Just a system that exists and keeps functioning exactly as it was introduced. I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, 1932. It doesn't dramatize reality, it removes the distance that usually makes it bearable. From the very beginning, I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang avoids exaggeration. There are no heightened emotional cues guiding your reaction, no dramatic framing to soften what's happening. Everything unfolds in a controlled, almost procedural way, and that restraint is what makes it heavier. Because the system it presents doesn't feel chaotic or broken. It feels organized. Every action follows a process. Every punishment feels routine. And that routine is what builds the tension, not from what might happen, but from what keeps happening. The repetition becomes the weight. Each moment reinforcing the idea that this isn't a one-time injustice, it's a cycle. And once you see that cycle, it becomes impossible to ignore. There's no sudden shock designed to grab your attention. Instead, the film relies on accumulation, on the slow realization that nothing here is accidental, that everything is functioning exactly as intended. And that realization lingers because it shifts the focus away from the individual and onto the structure itself. You're not just watching a story, you're watching a system operate, and the deeper it goes, the clearer it becomes that escape isn't just difficult, it's unlikely by design. That's what stays with you. Not a single moment, but the pattern behind all of them. Because it doesn't feel like fiction. It feels like something exposed. She'd done him wrong, 1933. It doesn't hide behind suggestion, and it delivers everything directly, without hesitation. From the first line, "She'd done him wrong" establishes its tone with precision. Every word feels intentional, every exchange controlled. There's no uncertainty in how it presents itself, and that clarity becomes its defining feature. At first, it feels bold, almost confrontational, like it's daring the audience to react. But then that boldness settles into consistency. The film doesn't escalate in the traditional sense. It doesn't build towards something bigger. Instead, it maintains its tone steadily, refusing to shift or soften. And that refusal becomes its strength. Because once you understand its rhythm, you start focusing on how it sustains it. Not what it's doing, but how far it's willing to keep doing it. That's where the tension builds. Not from surprise, but from persistence. It doesn't rely on hidden meaning or layered interpretation. And everything is presented clearly, leaving no space for ambiguity. And that lack of ambiguity creates a different kind of engagement. You're not decoding the story. You're observing its control, watching how consistently it holds its identity from beginning to end. And that consistency makes it memorable. Because instead of evolving, it commits. And in that commitment, it creates a rhythm that stays with you. Not because it changed, but because it never did. The Most Dangerous Game, 1932. It introduces its idea quickly and doesn't give you time to feel comfortable with it. The Most Dangerous Game wastes no time establishing its premise. There's no gradual buildup, no slow immersion into its world. It shifts the tone immediately, forcing you to adjust as the story moves forward. And once that shift happens, everything begins to feel different. The environment stops being neutral. Silence becomes deliberate. Every movement feels measured, controlled. And that control is what creates the tension. Because the danger here isn't random. It's designed, planned with intention, structured in a way that removes uncertainty. And that's what makes it unsettling. Not the unpredictability, but the lack of it. Every step feels accounted for. Every outcome feels possible because it's already been considered. And once that realization sets in, the film changes. It stops being about survival in the traditional sense. It becomes about control. Who has it, how it's used, and what it leads to. That shift creates pressure because it suggests that nothing happening is accidental. Everything is part of a larger design. And that design keeps unfolding without pause. You're not waiting for something unexpected. You're watching something inevitable move forward. And that inevitability is what holds your attention, because once it starts, it doesn't slow down. 3 on a Match, 1932. It begins with familiarity, and then removes it before you realize it's gone. 3 on a Match opens in a way that feels structured and recognizable. The characters are introduced clearly. The tone feels grounded. Everything appears stable, almost predictable, but that stability doesn't last. The progression is immediate. Events move quickly, stacking one after another without pause. And before you have time to fully settle into the story, it has already shifted direction. That's where the tension begins. Not from what's happening, but from how fast it's happening. There's no signal, no warning. The film doesn't prepare you for its changes. It simply moves forward, pulling you with it. And that constant movement removes your ability to anticipate what comes next. But it doesn't feel chaotic. It feels controlled. Every shift, no matter how sudden, feels intentional, as if it was always meant to unfold this way. And that intention creates a different kind of engagement. You're not trying to predict, you're trying to keep up. And that effort keeps your attention locked, because once the pace is established, it doesn't slow down. It maintains its momentum all the way through, and that momentum becomes its identity. Not the events themselves, but the speed at which they unfold. Because by the time you process one moment, the next has already begun. Night Nurse, 1931. It doesn't reveal its true tone immediately. It lets it form beneath the surface until it can't be ignored. Night Nurse begins with structure, routine, a sense of order that feels contained and predictable. At first, everything appears stable. The environment is defined, the roles are clear, and nothing seems out of place. But then, small details begin to shift. Subtly at first, almost easy to overlook. A change in atmosphere, a moment that feels slightly off. And those small shifts begin to accumulate. That's where the tension forms, not from a sudden break, but from a gradual transformation. The film doesn't rush into its darker elements. It allows them to develop slowly, building beneath the surface until they become unavoidable. And once that shift fully reveals itself, there's no return to the earlier tone. The sense of control disappears. What once felt structured now feels unstable, and that instability becomes the new normal. That's what makes it effective. Not the moment the change happens, but the moment you realize it already has. Because by then, the film has already moved forward. It doesn't pause. It doesn't explain. It continues, holding that tension in place, and that sustained tension keeps you engaged. Because you're no longer watching for what might happen. You're watching to understand what has already changed. Island of Lost Souls, 1932. It doesn't introduce its horror. It normalizes it first. Island of Lost Souls begins with curiosity, almost like a strange discovery waiting to be understood. But that curiosity quickly shifts into something else, something uncomfortable that doesn't fully explain itself. The island feels isolated, controlled, and completely detached from anything familiar. And that detachment is where the tension grows, because nothing here follows expected rules. The people don't behave normally. The environment doesn't feel stable. And the deeper the story moves, the clearer it becomes that this isn't about science. It's about control pushed too far. That's the unsettling part. Not what's being done, but how casually it's presented. There's no hesitation, no questioning. Just a system that continues to operate as if it's justified. And once that idea settles in, the film becomes harder to process, because it's not trying to shock you. It's trying to make you accept it, even for a moment. And that moment is enough to leave an impact that doesn't fade easily. The Story of Temple Drake, 1933. It doesn't build toward danger. It moves with the feeling that it's already there. The story of Temple Drake carries a sense of inevitability from the very beginning. Every interaction feels like it's leading somewhere the audience can already sense, but isn't ready to face. That's what creates the tension. Not surprise, but anticipation. The kind that builds slowly, quietly, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And when the story finally reaches its turning point, it doesn't release that pressure. It holds it. It lets it sit. And that stillness makes everything heavier. Because there's no resolution offered in the way you expect. No clear shift back to safety. Just a continuation of what's already been set in motion. And that's what makes it linger. Not the events themselves, but the feeling that once it started, there was no way it was going to stop. And the film never tries to convince you otherwise. Redheaded Woman, 1932. It doesn't hide intention. It puts it on display from the very beginning. Redheaded Woman introduces its character with clarity that feels almost disruptive. There's no mystery about what she wants, no slow reveal, just a direct approach that never changes. And that consistency is what makes it compelling. Because instead of building tension through uncertainty, the film builds it through execution. You know exactly what's coming. You just don't know how far it will go. And that how far becomes the driving force. Every step moves forward without hesitation. Every decision reinforces the same pattern. And what makes it stand out is how little resistance it faces. The world around her doesn't stop her. And it reacts, but it doesn't prevent. And that lack of consequence shifts the tone completely. Because the usual rules don't apply. And once that becomes clear, the film takes on a completely different energy. One that feels controlled, deliberate, and impossible to predict in the ways that matter most. Freaks, 1932. It doesn't feel like fiction. It feels like something real that you weren't meant to see. Freaks removes the distance most films rely on. There's no protective layer between the audience and what's happening on screen. Everything is direct. Everything is present. And that presence creates discomfort that doesn't fade quickly. The characters aren't exaggerated. They're real. And that reality changes how every scene is experienced. Because it doesn't feel constructed. It feels exposed. The tone shifts gradually. Dict almost quietly until it reaches a point where the film becomes something entirely different from what it started as. And when it reaches that point, it doesn't step back. It continues forward, fully committing to the direction it's taken. That's what makes it unforgettable. Not because it shocks in a single moment, but because it builds something that stays with you long after it ends. Something unresolved, something difficult to process, and something impossible to ignore once you've seen it. Babyface, 1933. It doesn't suggest the system. It explains it step by step. Babyface begins with clarity that feels almost unsettling. There's no ambiguity about what's happening or why. The strategy is presented openly, and from that point forward, everything follows a pattern that never breaks. That's what makes it powerful. Not the events themselves, but the structure behind them. Every move is calculated. Every step builds on the last. And instead of hiding that progression, the film highlights it. It wants you to see how it works. And once you do, the story changes. It stops being about individual moments and becomes about the system as a whole, one that continues to function exactly as intended. And that's where the discomfort comes from, because there's no interruption, no moment where it pauses or questions itself. It just continues. And by the time it reaches its peak, the impact isn't just in what happened, but in how clearly it was allowed to happen from the very beginning. And that's the part Hollywood doesn't like to revisit. These films weren't mistakes. They were experiments pushed too far. So how many more like this disappeared completely? And if this is what survived, what didn't? Because once you start looking back at this era, you realize something unsettling. The rules didn't create Hollywood. They erased parts of it.